The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus came to his hometown and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph, and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Then he went out among the villages teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. But he said to them, "Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." So they went on and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. The gospel of the Lord. While you were listening, I hope you were listening to the lessons that were read, specifically the second lesson that was read by Tom, I hope some of you sat up and said, "Wait, what did he say?" If not, forgive me, you probably were not listening very closely. Or you heard it in, like most of us, when we hear something that is odd or out of place or we don't understand, maybe you just put it up on the shelf thinking, "I really don't need that." And maybe we don't. We can certainly skip right over it, but what fun is there in that? Come on, let's remind ourselves of some of what we heard. Paul says he heard of someone who was caught up into the third heaven and paradise. Whether in the body or out of it, I don't know, he says. The third heaven, it sounds like he stepped onto an elevator and pushed 3. We might want to ask ourselves, what is Paul smoking? There's so much to talk about, but I'm going to start by saying I'm going to keep this short. I'm going to make a conscious effort to do so, because if I don't, I will lead you into the weeds in ways I think we'll never find our way out of it. First off, as I've said numerous times before, and as I hope you all know, as any Google search or visit to a bookstore will tell you, there are many notions of what we like to call heaven. I have books on my shelf with titles like A History of Heaven, A History of Heaven and Hell, etc. Our notions, the notions of those who have come before us, first in the Jewish faith and then the Christian, about heaven and judgment and what else there is beyond this life, well, they have developed and changed drastically over the years. Suffice it to say that when Paul lived as a Jew, among the beliefs and the popular beliefs of the Second Temple Judaism, it was thought that there were 7 levels of heaven, and that after the fall, the paradise of the Garden of Eden, along with the Tree of Life, were assumed into the third heaven, there to wait until the restoration of the heavens and the earth in the resurrection, when paradise, or Eden, would again be on earth, and when the Lord would come again. Talk of this third heaven can be found in the book of Enoch and elsewhere. Now, we could talk forever about some of the different notions. We simply, of course, do not know. But there might be some who think they know, which is kind of a segue into what is going on in this passage. There might be some in our society, some so-called preachers, some so-called theologians, who think that he or she is so great that they do know. They could tell you all about heaven and hell and judgment, and for a donation, you can get their latest book or a lock of their hair. I'm exaggerating, of course, but for the longest time, there have been those who, think they are super apostles or super preachers or first in the knowledge of God and all that God desires, and they are happy to tell you so. Paul was dealing with such super apostles who thought that they knew more than Paul and were seeking to lead the people of the Corinthian church, a church that Paul had worked with long and hard, to teach them and bring them into an understanding of the gospel. Now that Paul wasn't with them, there were others who were leading them astray, quite frankly. They are claiming their authority to do so by visions and revelations by God to them. Oh, yeah, well, I got carried off to the third heaven too, and I stayed there longer. So Paul plays their game a little bit. He says, I know of someone. Well, this is like when you say to someone, maybe a doctor, maybe a counselor, maybe a friend, you say, I have a friend, and we all know you're talking about yourself. Well, Paul is talking about himself. He is that person, and he is telling the Corinthians, look, if you want to base who you listen to and whether or not that person has had a vision or an experience of God that cannot be fully explained, well, I have had such a vision, such an experience. I am just as close to God as they are, in fact, closer. And why does he talk in the third person? Because to talk in the third person, it makes him a little removed from it. If he talked in the first person, it would be, well, more braggadocious, and he doesn't want to brag. That is the game these super apostles, these other preachers are playing as they try to lead the Corinthians away from Paul's teachings. But in the end, Paul won't play that game. He goes on to say quite simply, look, I could brag, but I won't. He reminds them that true authority and greatness is found in weakness. He says, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I'll boast all the more gladly of my weakness so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Look, I promise to keep this short, and I will. Like Paul, as your pastor and preacher, I can be possessive at times. I do not want you to be led astray from the gospel. I do not want us to fall in the traps of those who long for greatness, as the world defines it, in terms of money, power, and strength. Instead, God is there in our weakness, in our times when instead of feeling like we have been transported to some sort of paradise, we might feel like we are living through a living hell. Paul says that Satan has even inflicted him with a thorn in his flesh, a stake on which he falls, that he has asked God to remove it, but it's still there. And we have no idea what it was. We just don't know. But whatever it is, apparently the Corinthians maybe knew, it is something that reminds Paul that he is weak, he's fragile, that there are afflictions in this world as well as moments of paradise and joy. I was touched this week when a friend shared with me a funeral homily he had heard. He sent me the text. It was by the brother of the young man who committed suicide. The brother talked about how strong and loving his brother was, but that he also had his times of trouble and difficulty. His eulogy ended like this, I quote, "The reality is that my brother wasn't just a strong, loving, dutiful man. He was also a flawed man. He was strong, but he was weak. He was dutiful, but tired. Loving, but vulnerable. I called mental illness, anxiety, pain, and depression a disease and an enemy. But the reality is, as always, more complicated. Mental illness is not something we can nor should vilify. Anxiety isn't an enemy to overcome. Pain isn't something we can ignore, and depression isn't something we can just conquer. The reality is that these things are part of who we are. To a greater or lesser extent, part of who we all are. They are not a cause of shame. They are not a sign of weakness. They are not something to keep in the dark, but something to bring into the light. The expectation is that we all should be happy, healthy, well-adjusted individuals. The reality is that we often, usually, aren't. The expectation right now is sadness, despair, grief. The reality also has anger, fear, blame, doubt. And this is okay. People are complicated. We are expected to be proper caregivers, then we are expected to be strong and, well, normal, healthy. But when expectations and reality aren't aligned, life just gets a lot harder. The truth gets lost. My brother has once more given us a part of himself. Even now, he is working for us. He is showing us the truth. He reveals how difficult and complicated life can be, how expectation and reality are never the same. And he is showing us what we can do about it. We can strive to help each other, we can love each other, and we can work for each other as he did. So this is how I'm honoring my brother today, by asking myself and asking each of you to try and be the person we expected him to be: strong, loving, dutiful, always there. At the same time, I'm asking myself and asking each of you to be the person we didn't expect him to be: weak, vulnerable, tired. No one is an island. No one is without pain, depression, anxiety. No one has a life where reality meets expectations. So let us be like he was and show each other love and diligence, but also be like we wish he was and show each other vulnerability and weakness. End quote. There is no shame in weakness. It is the 4th of July weekend. We live in a wonderful country and we are blessed with amazing freedoms that are often taken for granted. We are without doubt the mightiest country on earth in terms of military and economy. I hope that we also remember those times when, in our weakness as a nation, we were strong. That when we sacrificed for others who were weak, we were great. I hope that if we want to see ourselves as a God-centered nation, we'll be willing to consider how God defines greatness. The weakness of the cross is the source of life for the world. God is with us in our weakness and in our strength. We do not have to be super apostles. We don't need to brag or talk about ourselves or look for glory or power. True super apostles don't do that. We don't have to be Paul. We are just asked to be children of the God who in weakness revealed the love of God that nothing can break. Amen.